This is not just the story of a famous comic strip. It's the story of what happens when a creator, known for satire, control, and precision, is suddenly forced to confront a reality that can't be edited, rewritten, or simplified. In the final months of his life, Scott Adams began sharing something very different from humor. Not punchlines, not commentary, but uncertainty. And the most revealing part of this story isn't what happened. It's how publicly it unfolded, step by step, in real time. For decades, Scott Adams was closely associated with a single idea: the quiet absurdity of office life. Through his long-running comic strip, he became known for exposing workplace culture, using dry humor and simple visuals. No dramatic villains, no exaggerated heroes, just systems that didn't always make sense, and people trying to function inside them. By the 1990s, his work had grown far beyond newspapers. Books, adaptations, and public appearances followed. His voice became familiar, predictable even, which is why what happened next felt so unexpected. In May, Adams publicly shared that he had been diagnosed with prostate cancer. The announcement itself was calm, measured. There was no dramatic framing, no emotional language. Instead, he approached the subject the same way he often approached ideas in his work, analytically. According to his own statements, he chose to speak openly about the diagnosis rather than keep it private. This decision marked a noticeable change in how his audience engaged with him. For the first time, the creator wasn't commenting on systems from the outside. He was inside one. In the months that followed, Adams continued to appear in live streams and public posts. These weren't dramatic updates. They were explanations. He discussed treatment options, scheduling challenges, and decisions that were still unresolved. At times, he emphasized that the process was complex and uncertain. Then, in November, he made a public request. According to his own account, Adams stated that a specific treatment, Pluvicto, had not yet been scheduled due to what he described as an administrative failure by his insurance provider. Rather than framing this as blame, he presented it as a breakdown in process. And that distinction mattered. What followed was unusual. After Adams publicly mentioned the issue, communication reportedly took place involving high-profile political figures. Soon after, the former president publicly acknowledged the situation with a short message. On it. The next day, Adams said that his treatment had been scheduled. At that moment, the story moved beyond health. It became about visibility. Many viewers didn't focus on the medical details. They focused on what it meant that attention itself appeared to change outcomes. But that sense of resolution didn't last long. In December, Adams stated that the planned treatment would be postponed. The reason, according to him, was the need for radiation therapy first. Once again, his tone remained controlled. There were no accusations, only uncertainty. During a live stream, he acknowledged that he didn't know whether the treatment would ever happen. That moment stood out, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't try to do. He didn't reassure. He didn't speculate. He simply left the question open. The reality sets. Later in December, Adams publicly shared that he was experiencing paralysis from the waist down. The statement was brief. There were no descriptions, no elaboration. It was a factual update, and a heavy one. By this point, the live streams had shifted in tone. They weren't about treatment schedules anymore. They were about adaptation, daily life, limitations, and acceptance of changing conditions. The quiet ending. On January 13th, Scott Adams passed away at the age of 68. The announcement came from his former wife, shared during a live stream. There were no dramatic headlines from him, no final statement, just the end of a timeline that many people had been watching in real time, not as spectators, but as witnesses. What made this story different wasn't only the events themselves, it was the format. For years, public figures shared carefully edited statements, press releases, interviews, polished narratives. But in this case, much of the story unfolded through live streams, unscripted, imperfect, and often quiet. There were pauses, moments where Adams searched for words, moments where he didn't. And that changed how people perceived the situation. Instead of a finished story, viewers were watching something unfinished and unresolved. Control versus reality. Throughout his career, Adams built a reputation around understanding systems, corporate structures, incentives, power dynamics. In his own commentary, he often emphasized predictability, how patterns repeat when people behave in consistent ways. But illness doesn't follow clear diagrams. According to his public statements, plans changed frequently. Treatments were delayed. Timelines shifted. And each change reinforced the same theme. Some systems don't respond to logic alone. The audience reaction. As updates continued, reactions followed. Some viewers expressed support. Others focused on broader implications. Access, fairness, visibility. But Adams himself rarely engaged with speculation. He avoided framing himself as a symbol. Instead, he kept returning to specifics. What was scheduled, what wasn't, and what remained unknown. That restraint mattered. It prevented the story from becoming confrontational and kept it informational. When humor wasn't the tool, one of the most striking elements was what didn't appear. There were no jokes about the situation, no attempts to turn hardship into commentary. For someone whose career was built on humor, that absence was noticeable. It suggested something important. Not every experience benefits from interpretation. Some simply need to be acknowledged. The weight of uncertainty. In later live streams, Adams spoke openly about not knowing what would happen next. He didn't frame this as fear, but as reality. That distinction shifted the emotional tone. The focus moved away from outcomes and toward presence, from what will happen to what is happening. And for viewers, that created a different kind of engagement. Slower, quieter, more reflective. The final updates. As December progressed, public updates became less frequent. When they did appear, they were brief. There was no attempt to summarize the journey. No closing statement. Just information, shared as it became available. And then there were no more updates at all. After the announcement, when the news of his passing was shared, it arrived without build-up. No countdown. No foreshadowing. For many viewers, it felt abrupt. Not because it was unexpected, but because there was no narrative closure. The story simply stopped. What remains Scott Adams left behind more than a comic strip. He left a record, not just of work, but of how a public figure navigated uncertainty without performance. No dramatization, no conflict-driven framing, just transparency, within limits. And that approach quietly reshaped how many people understood the relationship between creators and their audience. A different kind of legacy. When people talk about legacy, they usually focus on finished work, completed projects, final achievements. But in this case, the lasting impact may come from something unfinished. Scott Adams spent decades shaping how millions of people viewed everyday systems, especially work environments that felt rigid impersonal, or inefficient. Yet in his final month, the focus shifted away from systems he analyzed and toward one he was living inside. That contrast is important. The choice to be seen. According to publicly available information, Adams made a conscious decision to speak openly rather than withdraw. He didn't document everything. He didn't explain every detail. But he shared enough to allow people to follow along without asking them to interpret, judge, or react in any specific way. In doing so, he challenged an unspoken expectation that public figures should always present strength or certainty. Instead, he presented process. Why this resonated? Many viewers didn't connect to the medical specifics. They connected to the structure of the story. Plans were made. Plans changed. Answers were delayed. That pattern felt familiar, not because of illness, but because of life. In a world optimized for outcomes, this was a narrative without resolution, and that made it feel real. Silence as communication. As updates slowed, silence became part of the message. Not every absence needed explanation. Not every pause needed context. In an environment where constant engagement is expected, stepping back can say more than continued output. Adams never framed this silence as intentional, but it became meaningful anyway. The role of the viewer. One subtle aspect of this story is the position it placed the audience in. There was nothing to fix, nothing to debate. Viewers weren't participants. They were observers. And that shift reduced noise, speculation, and confrontation. It created space for reflection instead of reaction, from commentary to presence. For much of his career, Adams commented on how people interact with systems. In the final chapter, the commentary disappeared. What remained was presence, brief, factual, and unembellished. And for many, that absence of framing made the story stronger, not weaker. A broader pattern. This isn't an isolated case. More creators are choosing to share less, explain less, and allow uncertainty to exist publicly. Not as a strategy, but as a boundary. And this story became an early example of what that can look like. Stories usually end with answers. This one doesn't. And that may be its most honest feature. Scott Adams will always be remembered for Dilbert, for humor that simplified complex systems and made invisible frustrations visible. But the final chapter of his life offered something different. Not insight, not commentary, just reality, shared without direction. No lessons were spelled out. No conclusions were offered. Yet the message still landed. That even for people known for control, clarity, and analysis, there are moments where the only option is to acknowledge uncertainty and let it exist. This doesn't change his work. It adds context to it, and it quietly reshapes how we think about public storytelling in a digital world. Because sometimes, the most impactful stories aren't designed to persuade or entertain. They're simply allowed to unfold. In the next video, we'll look at how this shift toward public uncertainty is changing the relationship between creators and audiences, and why silence is becoming one of the most powerful forms of communication online.